When 23-year-old Desmond Doss arrived at the U.S. Army training camp at Fort Jackson in the world was already on fire. Nazi Germany was in control of Europe, and the Imperial Japanese Army was sweeping across the Pacific. For most American men, this was a call to arms. They were expected to pick up a rifle and learn how to kill. But Doss was different. He was a devout Seventh-day Adventist. He didn't just object to the war. He was a conscientious cooperator, a man willing to serve his country, but unwilling to take a single life. He believed in a commandment that left no room for interpretation: "Thou shalt not kill." It wasn't a decision based on fear or cowardice. It was a vow he had made as a child in Lynchburg, Virginia, after seeing a drawing of Cain and Abel that shook him to his core. He told the draft board he wanted to be a medic to save lives, not take team. But the U.S. Army in 1942 didn't understand conscience. They only understood soldiers. The moment he stepped into Fort Jackson, Doss became a target. In the eyes of his fellow soldiers in the 77th Infantry Division, a man without a gun was a dead man and a threat to the rest of the unit. The teasing began on the first day, but it quickly escalated to open hostility. During training, while other men were learning the mechanics of the M1 Garand, Doss sat quietly and prayed. His beliefs were tested at every turn. Men threw their boots at him while he prayed by his bunk. They cursed him. They called him a slacker, a shirker, and a coward. But Doss didn't retaliate. He performed his duties. He marched, he dug trenches, and he excelled in his medical training. He believed that if he could just get to the battlefield, he could prove his worth. The Army, however, had other plans. Officers tried to break him. They attempted to have him discharged as mentally unfit, labeling his faith as Section 8 insanity. When that failed, they tried to court-martial him for refusing to obey a direct order when he would not pick up a rifle. Yet, every single time, Doss stood his ground, calm, resolute, and always referring to his First Amendment right to religious freedom. Despite the near-constant harassment and official pushback, Doss remained a member of the 77th Infantry Division. It was a unit with a long and storied history, originally formed in 1917, and now it was being rebuilt for the fight of its life in the Pacific Theater. His fellow soldiers still distrusted him, but Doss was now their medic. This meant that, when the division deployed to Guam and Leyte, Doss was in the middle of some of the most brutal jungle warfare of the war. He was still the man who prayed, still the man without a gun. But now he was the man who would run forward when everyone else was diving for cover. It was during these campaigns that the 77th Division first saw the quiet strength of the man they had once tormented. On Guam and in the Philippines, Doss began proving that a coward with a medical bag was braver than any man with a rifle. But the true test of his vow, and the reason history would never forget his name, was still to come on a 400-foot limestone cliff in Okinawa. In the spring of 1945, the 77th Infantry Division arrived at the southern end of Okinawa. Standing in their way was the Maeda Escarpment, a massive, jagged limestone cliff that rose 400 feet straight into the air. To the Americans, it was Hacksaw Ridge. The Japanese had spent years turning this plateau into a fortress of interconnected tunnels, hidden machine gun nests, and spider holes designed to let soldiers vanish and reappear behind enemy lines. There was no easy way up. The men had to climb cargo nets draped over the rock face, carrying heavy equipment while exposed to mortar fire from above. For Desmond Doss, this wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a vertical slaughterhouse. The Japanese 32nd Army had orders to hold this ridge at all costs, as it was the final defensive line protecting the heart of the island. On May 5, 1945, the assault reached a breaking point. As the American troops finally crested the ridge, they were met with a ferocious Japanese. The air turned into a wall of lead and shrapnel. Men were being cut down faster than they could be counted. The command was given to retreat. A desperate scramble back to the edge of the cliff to descend the cargo nets. As the smoke cleared, the plateau was a landscape of carnage. Dozens of Americans lay wounded and bleeding in the dirt, unablatumab with the Japanese forces closing in to finish them off. From the safety of the base of the cliff, the officers looked up and saw that only one man had refused to retreat. Desmond Doss remained at the top, alone, unarmed, and surrounded by an enemy that did not take prisoners. He began to move toward the screams. What followed was a 12-hour display of endurance that defied military logic. For the rest of the day and through the long night, Doss dragged wounded men, one by one, through the mud and over the jagged rocks, toward the edge of the escarpment. Every time he reached a soldier, he had to keep his body lower than the tall grass to avoid the snipers who were actively hunting him. When he reached the cliff's edge, he realized he couldn't simply drop the men 400 feet to the bottom. He improvised a way to lower them using a rope he found, tied into a specialized knot. Each time he successfully lowered a man to the waiting medics below, he didn't head down himself. Instead, he turned back toward the fire, whispering the same prayer. "Lord, please, help me get just one more." By the time he finally came down the ridge himself, his hands were shredded and his body was spent. But he had single-handedly rescued 75 men that the army had already written off as dead. The survival of the 75 men on Hacksaw Ridge came down to a single piece of rope and a skill Doss had learned in his youth. At the edge of the 400-foot vertical drop, there was no mechanical hoist or winch to lower the mangled bodies of the wounded. Doss had to rely on a double bolinata loop that provided a makeshift seat for the legs and a support for the chest. Under constant fire, with his heart hammering against his ribs, Doss tied each man into the harness and slowly let the rope slip through his bloodied hands. He wrapped the rope around a tree stump to create enough friction to keep the weight from pulling him over the edge. Every inch of descent was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. Each time he pulled the empty rope back up, the Japanese snipers adjusted their aim. Yet Doss continued the cycle until the plateau was empty of living Americans. The heroism on the ridge was not the end of Dossie's ordeal. The battle for Okinawa continued into the following weeks, and the man who refused to carry a gun remained in the thick of the most violent sectors. On the night of May 21st, 1945, during a night attack near Shur, Doss was crouched in a shell hole with 2 other soldiers when a Japanese grenade landed at his feet. Instead of diving away, he stepped on the grenade to shield his fellow soldiers. The blast peppered his legs with shrapnel and tore deep into his hip. Rather than calling for another medic to risk their life in the open, Doss treated his own wounds and waited 5 hours for daylight. As he was finally being carried away on a litter, he saw a soldier more severely wounded than himself. Doss crawled off the stretcher and directed the bearers to take the other man instead. While waiting for their return, a sniper's bullet shattered his arm. To keep his broken limb stable, he lashed a rifle stock to his arm as a splinty, only time he would ever carry a weapon, and crawled 300 yards through the dirt to the safety of an aid station. On October 12th, 1945, the man who had been threatened with a court-martial for cowardice stood on the lawn of the White House. Wash? Frail. His body still recovering from the jagged shrapnel and the sniper's bullet that had shattered his arm. But he stood tall in his dress uniform. President Harry S. Truman took the Medal of Honor of the United States, highest military decoration, hung it around the neck of the Seventh-day Adventist medic. The president leaned in and shook his hand, saying, "I consider this a greater honor than being president." Desmond Doss had become the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the medal. He didn't receive it for taking a hill or defeating an enemy, but for the impossible feat of saving his own. The end of the war did not end the bond between Doss and the men of the 77th Infantry Division, the soldiers who had once thrown boots at him while he prayed, and the officers who had tried to strip him of his rank, spent the rest of their lives calling him the bravest man they had ever known. Doss spent his post-war years in quiet humility, often downplaying his own actions and attributing his survival to a higher power. He lived to see the men he saved grow old, raise families, and tell their grandchildren about the unarmed medic who stayed behind when everyone else ran. When Doss passed away in 2006 at the age of 87, he was buried with full military honors, leaving behind a legacy that fundamentally changed the military's view of faith and service. Desmond Doss proved to the world that conviction is not the same as weakness. He walked into the deadliest environment on Earth without a way to defend himself, armed only with a rope and a promise. In a world that often measures strength by the power to destroy, his life remains a towering reminder that the greatest courage is the power to preserve. He didn't just survive Hacksaw Ridge, he conquered it by refusing to let the hatred of war consume his humanity. We live in a time where it is easy to follow the crowd, but Doss challenges us to stand by our principles, even when the whole world is screaming at us to pick up the gun. He was a man who went to war to save it, and in doing so, he became a hero for the ages.